Hi, my name is Hannah, and this is my final for United Nations in the global arena. The United Nations was created in 1945 as a result of a chain reaction of failures. We had World War I that ended with the world in chaos in need of security and peace. And the League of Nations was formed in an attempt to secure that peace and security. What ended up happening was failure after failure and them setting themselves up for World War II. The aggressor countries were not being held accountable, mostly because a full consensus was required to take any action, and that rendered them indecisive and quite useless in making actual beneficial changes, even when they knew aggressors were being aggressive. Another large problem was that the United States, being such a large and powerful country, especially within World War I and later in World War II, they were not a part of the League of Nations because they could not get it to pass through the Senate. All of this kind of peaked, and the League of Nations' biggest failure was World War II, as it marked its inability to prevent and secure peace. After World War II, we were left in such an economic and social chaotic world and devastation, and we were in dire need of some changes. Winston Churchill and, Franklin D. Roosevelt brought to Winston Churchill this idea that the United States is ready to fight for peace in this world and security and do what it takes. And so Roosevelt and Churchill worked together and kind of spearheaded Churchill's four policemen idea, which would eventually evolve into the Security Council, or later inspire the Security Council. There were concerns that were coming from the smaller countries that the UN Charter was able to address, and other areas of the League of Nations failures that would later shape how the United Nations was able to evolve. Some of the concerns that these smaller countries had were about wanting representation, decolonization, self-determination, and some of the ways that the United Nations was able to address these concerns was through the General Assembly body that was made up of all member states. And they were able to give some power to these smaller countries through the power of the purse, very similar to how Congress interacts with our executive branch. Within that, then we have the Security Council, which takes all of those actionable items and is the determining, binding decision makers. And while there are 5 permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, China, now Russia, formerly USSR, and France, there are 10 rotating positions for smaller countries that are voted upon. And also in chapters 9 through 13 of the Charter, there are different statements on decolonization, self-determination, and this economic and social development that these smaller countries desperately needed help in, especially post-World War II. The first 15 years of the United Nations was marked by 4 key developments: the Palestinian mediation, the Korean War, the Suez Crisis of 1956, and the Congo Crisis. The Palestinian mediation was an opportunity not only for the UN to facilitate these negotiations of peace and truce, but to also implement them. They were able to establish a UN deployment of neutral multinational observers on the ground in these conflict-ridden areas and instilled confidence that these respective countries that these peace agreements would be upheld and all parties would be held accountable. The Korean War was an opportunity for the United Nations to show how much it had learned from the League of Nations failures and to hold aggressor countries to the highest accountability. Unfortunately, this did put the UN Security Council into its first gridlock, which then led to the adoption of a resolution to allow the General Assembly to take action when the Security Council is unable to. This was also the first time that the UN voted to use armed force as a means to stop armed force. The Suez Crisis of 1956 also found the Security Council in a gridlock. And it showed that while there are two parties on the Security Council, there is still room for peacekeeping and the advancement of the UN's involvement in situations. They were able to set up the UN emergency force, and this really set the precedence for future peacekeeping. The crisis in the Congo is possibly one of the most significant peacekeeping missions of all times for the United Nations. It was the first time that the United Nations had gone into a situation that was more of an internal conflict, but had great possibility for external consequences. One of the largest factors of this mission was the complexity and size of deployment. There was so much going on in so many different areas, and it was quite risky for the Secretary General to allow for this kind of intervention. The United Nations has taken on this role as an agent of change and focusing attention on global challenges, shaping international norms, and facilitating multilateral agreements. Some of the ways that they do that is through their Sustainable Development Goals. Some of these goals are poverty, education, gender equality, affordable and clean energy, and as well as partnerships. They have been quite successful in some of these areas. Some examples are world poverty. Their goal was to reduce world poverty by 50%, and from 2000 to 2015, it did decline from 47% to 14%. Gender gap saw quite large advancements in 0.98 girl for every boy at the primary level. There have been other large advances, but there have been some setbacks, and our current goals are aiming to be completed by 2030. Now, some of the problems are just logistically, they're difficult. Currently, we're sitting at 15% of our goals are on track. That means they are set to be accomplished by 2030. About 50% are making progress but not on time. So we're seeing significant increases in these goals, and we're making progress, but they're not going to be completed by 2030. And 35% of these are either stagnant or regressing. One of the ones that is most notable in regression is actually drinking water. There have been many more millions of people affected by unclean drinking water since the beginning of these sustainability goals. And it is very important to take note that COVID-19 was a large factor in us going to the lengths we have in these setbacks. So the United Nations currently is being critiqued on how outdated the Security Council is. It is reflecting a 1945 power dynamic that is not congruent to what is going on in 2023. A small proportion of the General Assembly is being represented on the Security Council, with only 10 member positions to the 193, 188 if you take out the 5 permanent members on the Security Council, and that proportion is continuing to get smaller and smaller as new members join the United Nations. There are some different reform proposals. There's the G4 proposal, the Uniting for Consensus, and the African Union, and all 3 of these aim to change the Security Council in various ways, changing permanent members, changing the number of elected members, and so on and so on. Some of the alternative options are enhancing the role of the 10 elected members, and really utilizing the roles that they currently have. We've seen this with some of the E10 members using their presidencies and their terms in a continuous succession to highlight certain issues. One of the examples discussed was the peace and security of women in 2021, and how 3 different presidencies were able to tackle this topic. Another alternative is using the influence that these 10 elected members have on these 5 permanent members to help encourage them to voluntarily refrain from using the veto power. And this causes problems with the general idea that these 5 superpowers or 5 permanent members do not feel constrained by the choices of smaller countries. The UN mission in South Sudan has a lot going on, but 3 of the main issues that are plaguing this country are their first election since independence, their humanitarian crisis as a result of external factors, and the internal humanitarian crisis. The first election is marked with ethnic and political violence, with clear divides that are only getting worse, unfortunately, at the moment, as there is violations by current elected officials to the peace agreements that are allowing for these free and independent elections to happen. And these humanitarian crises, from an external perspective, are a direct result from the conflict going on in Sudan and the amount of refugees and returnees that are being forced across the border into South Sudan. And these crossing points are often without aid and in high flood areas with poor circumstances to be fleeing from. Unfortunately, at times, it is better off for people to stay in the war zone than it is to go to the humanitarian relief zone. And one of the other key issues is the internal humanitarian crisis that the South Sudanese people are facing. There is persecution of women. There has been reports of many different prominent people in South Sudan committing horrible and heinous crimes against women and children, and even the after effects of the civil war in South Sudan is creating this crisis for these people, and they can't go into certain areas because of landmines from a war that was over 10 years ago. And as they continue to progress, there are some major things that they can be doing to help them continue. First and foremost, there needs to be more aid in these border areas. Currently, there is not aid going into these direct border areas in these camps, but they have high floods. People are dying every day due to these flooding, disease, failed snakes, improper housing, lack of food, and clean drinking water. We need to get boots on the ground to these border states to help save lives in a practical sense. On top of that, there needs to be a clear condemnation of political and ethnic violence to the highest extent. We cannot help these people progress towards a free and fair election when they are being marked by violence and political corruption at a very obvious point, especially the relationship between the president and vice president currently needs to be addressed. And kind of as a complement to that, we need to be working to develop these political and ethnic leaders who are going to instill change, who are going to fight for South Sudan as a whole. This is not about one party or another, one ethnicity or another, one region, one group. It is about South Sudan becoming a free and fair country that can elect leaders and continue to develop and progress. There's so much potential for this country. They just need to be developed, and it can't be the United Nations. It has to be South Sudan, and the United Nations has to teach them how they can help themselves.